Helen Puttock kisses her 2 children goodbye as she heads off to spend the night dancing at Glasgow's Barrowland Ballroom. Whilst there, she meets a young handsome man by the name of John. Throughout their conversation, John inexplicably quotes from the Bible. The following morning, Helen's body is discovered, strangled by the very stocking she had worn the night previous. The man responsible.
We are talking about one Bible John.
This is Bible John.
The so-called Bible John.
For this and other cases like it, I'm Jess, and this is Skinwalker. Search for Skinwalker True Crime on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Good evening, friends. You're listening to the True Crime Witch podcast, the podcast that takes you into everything murderous, mysterious, and downright macabre. I'm your host, Emma, and you're listening to episode 24, The Dark Side of Finland. I have a few shout-outs this week for everyone who gave the podcast a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like a shout-out, just leave me a 5-star review along with your name and where you're from, and I'll read it out at the beginning of the episode. So here we go. So a huge thank you to Prash's Murder Map from the UK, Just Spilling It podcast from the USA, Leo Crows the Third, I assume, from the USA, Henry from LA, and Flick from the UK. Thank you so much. Those reviews and ratings really help us to climb the charts and get more recognition. So thank you. If you'd like to support this one-on-one podcast, you can head over to my Patreon at www.patreon.com/truecrimewitchpodcast. You'll get early access to episodes, exclusive content, and you'll be able to help the podcast keep on running. Your support cannot be overstated. Thank you so much. You can find the podcast on Twitter at truecrimewitch, Instagram at truecrimewitchpodcast. I have a Facebook group and a Facebook page. If you just search for the True Crime Witch podcast, it shall pop up. Warning: the True Crime Witch podcast covers topics such as rape, murder, crimes against children, and other sensitive topics. This podcast won't be for everyone, and your discretion is advised. This is episode 24, The Dark Side of Finland. That would be a nightmare if we didn't record any of this.
True. Is my microphone
True.
efficient? Is it?
Yeah, your microphone sounds fine on my end. It sounds all good.
Okay, wonderful.
Right, so this is episode 24, and we're talking about Finnish crimes. And today I have a very special guest, so if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. My name is Teemu. I'm from Finland, and I have a fairly vast web internet presence. I have an Instagram account, and a blog, and a podcast of my own. My internet alias is Forensic, Forenseek. So it's a kind of a play on the word forensic. And I also have an app that I developed with a Finnish company called Vertix, that kind of takes you on tours of these dark history locations. The app is also called Forensic.
Incredible. So if you haven't already checked out his Instagram page or his apps, you better go do so. So, we are talking, obviously, about Finnish crimes, and Timu is going to take us through those. So let's begin.
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to say that Finland has a fairly effective marketing team. They even have a kind of umbrella term for themselves. They're called Team Finland, and it's basically a kind of a conglomerate of people from all kinds of walks of life who are dedicated to marketing Finland abroad as a great place to do business and take vacations and so on. And they're pretty effective, as I said. So basically, when you ask your friend about Finland and what kinds of things do you associate with Finland, you probably get things like skiing and hiking in nature. Basically, the country's image is kind of that of a respite from the hurries and worries of the outside world. But the truth is that there's this kind of much darker side to the country where, for example, alcohol consumption is it's getting it's it isn't as big as it used to be. The younger generation seems to be more
Right.
intelligent in this regard, but it's still people still drink a lot, and the kind of average Finnish homicide is A and B get drunk, and they haven't eaten anything, so blood sugar is low, and then they get into an argument, and A ends up stabbing B,
Oh,
and then
wow.
passes out, and neither of them, well, obviously the dead person doesn't remember it, but the perpetrator doesn't remember it either. And then when he wakes up in the morning, he himself calls the cops, and the cops have a fairly easy time solving the average Finnish homicide. But then there are these cases in Finnish history that are clearly more complicated. They seem to have outside perpetrators. That is, the killer doesn't seem to be somebody that the victim knew. And the Finnish police often have a really difficult time solving these kinds of crimes because they don't seem to have the experience for solving them. So they have to ask for help from organizations like the, let's say, the FBI and the Scotland Yard and so
Mm-hmm.
on. And we decided on a list of 5 such more complicated cases to feature today. And the first one is the kind of all time classic. It's from the year 1953, and it's the murder of Kyllikki Saari. Kyllikki was a 17-year-old young lady living in a small town in kind of southwestern Finland called Isojoki, which translates as big river or something like that.
I just want to say that I'm so glad that you're doing the Finnish pronunciations because I looked at these
Yeah.
and I was like, nope.
Yeah, it's that's been a problem. I've been a guest on a
Yep.
couple of English language podcasts before, and they always. And I'm glad to do it. Finnish is a fairly rare language, so
Yeah,
no
Finnish is
problem.
a strange one. I have a friend who's Latvian and even he's like I have no idea.
Yeah, yeah. But Kyllikki was she was a young lady from a farming house, sort of a classic farming manor in southwestern Finland. She was religious. She attended the local congregation very actively and had a very, let's say, good reputation in the community by those
Mm-hmm.
the standards of the early 1950s. Um, then on the 17th of May 1953, Kyllikki attended a local youth event at her congregation in downtown Isojoki. And after the event was over, she took her bike, and a friend accompanied her, and they cycled together to this old mill, and that's where their roads, their paths took off in different directions. Kyllikki went her way, and her friend went hers. And Kyllikki's last words to her friend were, "I hope nothing bad happens. Let's
Oh
hope
God.
everything goes as it's always gone." Something like that. And she started cycling home. Her home was in at the it was reached through this secluded country road. She was cycling in the middle of the night, and during that journey home, somebody assaulted her, attacked her from the woods. The killer had probably been waiting for her there. Possibly it was somebody with an infatuation for
Mhm.
her, and the murderer stopped Kyllikki, possibly tried to make some kind of a pass at her. Perhaps Kyllikki put up a fight, and the killer ended up basically smashing her to death with,
Wow.
if I remember correctly, it was a knife and some kind of a blunt object, possibly a rock or a metal pipe or something like that. But
So
for the Isojoki community, of course, this didn't start as a murder. Kyllikki simply disappeared,
right.
and
Okay.
they started investigating the disappearance, and the military was called to help to kind of canvass the area and look for her. Finally, one soldier noticed that there was a stick sticking up from like a little bump in a swampy area, and the guy noticed that this is not a natural growth, that this is not a natural plant. So he picked it up, picked up the stick, and noticed that it had been planted there.
Oh
And
God.
he dug a little deeper, and that's where Kyllikki was found. She was laying in a swampy grave. The killer had carried her from the secluded road, kind of deeper into the woods, where he had dumped her body in a makeshift grave, and then threw earth and sticks and stones on her body. And personally, I've been there. There's even a memorial for Kyllikki nowadays,
That's
and
nice. I like that.
yeah. And one of the things you'll notice when you visit it is that the killer had to be very strong. The path from the road to the grave area where she was discovered is fairly long, especially if you're carrying another person. And it's also kind of a difficult terrain to navigate. You don't walk down that path like you would walk down an asphalt road or something.
Right.
You
Okay.
have to have some strength in your feet and your hands. So this already implies that whoever killed her was pretty strong. But anyway, the National Bureau of Investigations became involved after her body was discovered, and there were literally hundreds of people interrogated and interviewed, and the investigation was extremely vast. When Kyllikki was buried, there were thousands of people at her funeral because it was such a huge media event. Nobody could
Yeah.
believe that this could happen in Finland, but it had, and so the media just ran with it, and every day was the headline screamed something about the Kyllikki Saari atrocity. But despite a long and a very detailed investigation, the killer was never found. There were all kinds of suspects, but it remains unsolved.
Am I right in thinking that one of the suspects in Kyllikki's case was also a suspect in the Lake Bodom killings?
Yes, this was a man named Hans Assmann. He was a German immigrant who had an
Okay.
extremely violent temper. There was one amateur investigator, especially in Finland, called Jorma Palo. He was a neurosurgeon who treated Assmann in the 1960s and started to believe after conversations with him and some bizarre behavior from the guy that he may have been guilty of the Lake Bodom Murderous and also the Kyllikki Saari killing. But Osman was he had a massive mouth. He was a big talker, big
Right.
braggart. He most likely is not the killer of at least Kyllikki Saari. And another suspect in Kyllikki's case was actually the local, I think the word is vicar, the local priest, head of the congregation. His name was Kauko Kanervo, and he had a reputation as somebody who occasionally misused his authority and his position as an
Right.
influence over the young people
Young
in the
people.
neighborhood. Yeah, and he was one of the suspects, but he apparently had an alibi for the night. And just recently, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigations actually released some old case files pertaining to the Kyllikki Saari murder.
Oh wow.
And these files imply very strongly that the NBI hadn't. They essentially at least believed they had their man. It was a local uh, laborer who had some sort of an infatuation with Kyllikki, and apparently there were some witnesses and some people interviewed locals who even testified, told the police
Okay.
that this guy had been bothering Kyllikki before. But personally, I'm perhaps a little skeptical of that because uh, usually, if you have a pretty good suspect, the evidence will hold up in court. Finnish
Yeah.
court is reasonably, uh, let's say, reliable in this regard. So I think the guy probably would have been brought to justice if the evidence was really so overwhelming as some of those case files recently released seem to imply. So in my mind, it's simply a cold dead case. It's
Yes.
probably never going to be solved.
It just doesn't seem like a crime of opportunity. Like it seems very specific that someone would be waiting for her in the middle of the night on this specific path.
Yes, and if you visit the path, it's still there. You'll notice that there's no way you just suddenly come across and you're, let's say, pissed off over something and you just decide to take
Yeah.
it out on the first person. You'd have to wait there for a pretty long time for anybody to show up, let alone someone like Kyllikki, who was the kind of perfect victim. She was a little naive about the world, maybe, and was not very strong. So
Yeah.
whoever killed her probably knew her, at least by reputation, and had some sort of an infatuation with her, and
Yeah.
decided on that night that that's when it was going to happen.
It wasn't so much of a case of I'm just gonna walk down this road and kill the first person I see. It's gonna be Kyllikki.
Yes, it's going to be Kyllikki, and personally, I think that perhaps it had something to do with this kind of religious um, upbringing and religious personality that Kyllikki had. The killer may have spotted her at, let's say, at a religious gathering, a church service or mass or
Mm-hmm.
something like that, because he knew that Kyllikki would attend these religious gatherings and knew that Kyllikki would be there that night and then afterwards cycling home. And Kyllikki would sometimes, because she actually worked a job at the local congregation, she would occasionally sleep at the kind of congregations, like, I don't know what the word is, but the congregation owned a house downtown, and Kyllikki would occasionally sleep there instead of cycling home after attending a service or doing her job late in the evening. But this evening, the killer knew that she would not be staying there. She
Yeah,
would be
so
cycling home.
he had to
So
know her quite well.
exactly, yeah, I had to know something about her life in order to kind of anticipate her moves and comings and goings.
Was there any sign of sexual assault, do you know?
Kyllikki's body was very badly. Um, it was in a bad condition when it was
Yeah.
found. Decomposition had already set in, and so if I remember correctly, it was impossible to determine if that had actually happened. But I guess there were no overt signs of a
Yeah,
sexual assault.
it's also 1953, so we don't have everything that we do now.
It is indeed, and one of the things about sexual homicides is that even if the let's say the organs don't meet, it can still be sexual in nature. You can the knife can take the place of the organ, and it can still
Yeah.
be a kind of sexual climax for the killer, even if there's no semen found or something like that. So it's entirely possible that there was some sexual subtext to the killing.
I feel like that's the most plausible reason, especially given the location and who she was. She was 17, so I feel like it's definitely got to be someone that was at least sexually interested in her, and she sort of said no.
Absolutely, and there was also Kyllikki had no enemies, so this wouldn't be like she owed somebody money and they took her out. There's no other sort of discernible motive besides a
Yeah.
sexual obsession of some sort.
So, next case, Lake Bodom.
Yeah, this is easily the most well-known case, Finnish case outside of Finland as well. There's a band, it's a metal band called Children of Bodom.
That's how I know this case.
Yes, yeah, exactly. They actually changed their name. They're now Bodom after midnight, or Bodom at midnight, or something like that.
Okay.
But yeah, that band takes its name from this case. Alexi Laiho, the guitarist and singer of the band, is from Espoo, where this happened. And as I understand, he grew up somewhere in the vicinity of the lake. But this took place in 1960. There were four teenagers. Their names were Seppo Boisman, Niels Gustafsson, Tulkkimäki, and I think it was Irmeli Björklund was the fourth. And they were essentially two couples, although they were mostly on the kind of, let's say, the dating sector
Yeah,
of a relationship.
more casual than.
More casual than, let's say, eternal lovers who had exchanged
Yeah.
vows or anything like that. So there was a kind of exploration phase going on in their relationships. They decided to go out camping at Lake Bodom in June of 1960, and they had some. They did have condoms with them. They had some liquor that they had bought, but overall, it was the kind of sexual culture, even among teenagers at the time, was nothing particularly raunchy. They were there basically to spend time together with their age peers. They were all young and wanted to get away from home, and the Lake Bodom area in Espoo was certainly, still is actually, fairly popular for these kinds of activities. It's a pretty busy area with families and couples and campers and hikers and so on, swimmers, of course. They set up their tent at one of the. There's this kind of outgrowth that, let's say, like I don't know if bay is the right word, but there are these, like, how would I describe? What is it? Niemi. It's like there are two of these or three of these, like areas of land that stretch out towards the lake. I can't think of
Yeah,
a better description.
I think bay or like shoreline. I don't really
Yeah,
know. 'Cause it's a
that's
lake.
right.
Yeah.
And they set up their camp at one of these spots. And the evening rather, was spent talking, probably drinking, some kissing, and swimming and fishing. And when the evening came to a close, they went to the tent and closed the door, and the sole survivor of the event, Niels Gustafsson, later said that this is the last thing that he remembers is the zipper of the door going closed and all of them going to sleep. During the night, somebody assaulted them. This person broke the kind of build of the tent, and the tent canvas dropped on the 4 teenagers. He then jumped on top of the teens and started just basically smashing away at them with a knife and a blunt object, probably a rock, which he later threw to the lake.
Oh, God.
It was a massive carnage. All 3 of the teens who ended up dying, they pretty much died immediately. It was just a total bloody mess. But one person, according to his own story, was able to make it out of the tent alive, and this person was Niels Gustafsson. Gustafsson claims that he made his way out of the tent and tried to somehow engage in a fight with the attacker, but the attacker ended up knocking him out and apparently tried to drag him into the lake, but never did for some reason. And this is when the kind of last glimpse at the actual events occurred. After this, we don't know for sure, but the next morning, there was a man with his children going swimming at Lake Bodom, and he discovered this murder site.
Oh, my God.
Apparently, all of the teens who were killed were inside the tent under the canvas still, and the canvas was torn all over the place, but they were at the sort of bottom of the pile, and then Niels Gustafsson was on top of the pile. And Gustafsson was sort of gurgling and making noises to be noticed and be helped by these people who had showed up at the lake. They called the cops, and the cops were. This is one of the sort of famous quotes of Finnish true crime history. Is the cops when they were called, they called for backup, and they said "isoremmi päälle, Bodomilla on piru irti," which means like we need to go there in big numbers. The devil is on the loose at Lake Bodom, or something like that.
Oh, wow.
And the cops arrived, and they took Niels Gustafsson to a hospital, and the rest of them were just. The 3 were Kyllikki Seppo and Irmeli were just dead. There was nothing to be done about it.
Yeah. No coming back from that, is there?
No, not at all. The killer had been in total rage. I mean, it was just there's even a word for it, just overkill. They had just been smashed and smashed even after they were clearly dead. And Niels was taken to the hospital, where the doctor who examined him at the time clearly stated that he was indeed in a very bad condition, and just long story short, he believed Gustafsson's tale, and he believed that the wounds corroborated the story that he had indeed been knocked out and had also received stabbings from the killer's knife. This years later, this came under scrutiny and doubt, but so that was the analysis of the doctor, diagnosis of the doctor at the time, that this did indeed happen. And as you can expect, there was a huge media event over this. It was in the news for years. My dad was born in 1946. My mother in 1947, and they both remember this event. It kind of broke the beautiful and sunny summer, and kind of this dark cloud moved over Finland after that. It was the kind of innocent days of summer and friendship were over after this. And the cops investigated this. Everybody was involved. They had the Helsinki police involved, the Espoo police, the National Bureau of Investigation, or I think it's Finnish Bureau of Investigations. In Finnish, it's Keskusrikospoliisi. So everybody was involved, and the army was called, and they went through the area with a massive canvas. I mean, there was just fucking everybody they could pull was there. But they never found the knife. They never found some things that were taken from the youngsters. at the campsite. But one strange discovery that they made was that a pair of shoes had been stolen from one of the male kids, and the shoes were later found in like a little hole in the forest. So the killer had taken them and then, for some reason, discarded them there. But the murder weapon was never found, not in the lake, not up in the trees. They used these metal detectors and everything, but nothing was ever found, unfortunately. And suspects started to be developed. They were mostly local people who there was one guy who owned this kiosk, this where he sold like ice cream and sodas and so on. And he was a fairly strong suspect because apparently he hated local kids for camping out at the area and leaving trash and that sort of thing. But there was never any actual physical evidence to tie him to the case. And I believe he had an alibi. He had indeed slept next to his wife the whole night when this massacre took place. And this is also the Lake Bodom case is a kind of fine example of this bizarre phenomenon where all kinds of folklore and bizarre tales kind of attach themselves to these famous cases. And one kind of common feature that later featured in many Finnish crime cases started at Lake Bodom, and that was the legend of somebody who confessed and then immediately killed themselves. And this is something that comes. You'll notice this if you research Finnish cases.
Yeah.
There's always somebody who, oh yeah, it was him, and he even he said he did it, but then he killed himself. So we're never able to investigate it. But there's no way to be placed on such claims. One guy
Yeah.
drowned himself in the lake, and supposedly just before he went down for the last time, he yelled out, "Watch me dive for the last time." He had apparently also confessed to these killings, and then he drowned himself in the lake and committed suicide. But it's the case is simply open. We don't know who did this.
It's one of those that you feel like you might never actually find the answer because it's been so long.
It's been so long, but it certainly hasn't been for a lack of trying. This is such a massive case in Finland. It's the kind of all-time classic, and the Bureau of Investigation actually brought Niels Gustafsson, the survivor of this incident, before a court in 2005. And their case was built basically on DNA extracted mostly from the shoes. They believed that there was no way for the blood patterns to be the way they were unless Gustafsson was the killer and he was wearing those shoes when he committed the crimes. So it was basically built on this one card, but they were never able to prove it. So the defense lawyer was able to knock down their case, and Gustafsson was never sentenced, but he was kind of forever marked after this. Nobody had ever, well, maybe some investigators and some people in the know had believed that it may have been Gustafsson, but for most Finns, it was a total surprise. I remember when I read in the papers that a new suspect had been arrested in this age-old case. I never believed it could be Gustafsson, but he was arrested and they tried him, but the verdict came out innocent.
Yeah, it just seems like, how would he injure himself that badly?
Yes, the prosecutors made the case that Seppo, the other male, and possibly the females as well, had put up a fight through the tent canvas, or that there
Okay.
had been, and the case was built on the idea that that Niels had been turned down sexually, and the rest of the teenagers had kind of closed him out of the group and left him outside the tent. And then Niels entered, he went into a rage, he was drunk, hadn't eaten anything for a while, and then he carried out these murders. But like I said, this was just conjecture. the evidence was tested in an actual court, and at some point you have to just kind of trust the court and
Yeah.
trust their assessment. Otherwise, there's no way to ever establish any truth.
It
So I,
seems like it would,
yep,
sorry, it would be a lot of effort and a lot of energy for a 17-year-old to kill 3 people. It
yeah.
just seems like it would be, he would have to be very strong and on something, I guess. It just seems like very excessive that you could kill 3 people in such a brutal fashion like that.
Indeed, and Gustafsson would also have to be pretty cold just as a person because he lived a fairly normal life after this. He was a bus driver. He drove his bus. He had a house in Espoo, so he never even felt this need to leave. He lived in Espoo his whole life. He's still alive. He's retired now. So he'd have to be just essentially a total psychopath in order to be able to live with this and lie to his friends and his wife. And he doesn't come across as that kind of a person. He was a totally regular Finnish bloke um, who never gave any signs of being somehow emotionally cold or particularly cruel and vicious. The prosecutors also played with the idea that he had kind of compartmentalized this event, and he had somehow subconsciously convinced himself that he didn't do it, and therefore was able to live a normal life. But again, we enter into some pretty murky territory that's
Yeah.
totally based on conjecture and speculation. And besides, there were witnesses who actually saw people leaving the area. There was one fisherman who was there in the morning of the murders. The murders that happened the night before. This guy was fishing in the morning, and he saw somebody leave the area and walk towards the woods. And there were also some other sightings of people moving in the area, and these descriptions did not fit the physical description of Niels Gustafsson.
So, the next case, I'm not even going to try and pronounce this one, so I'm going to let you do the honors.
Yeah, the Tulilahti murders is, like I said, many people know Lake Bodom outside of Finland, but they don't know about Tulilahti. And this is a mistake in analyzing the Bodom case because these two might just be somehow connected. The Tulilahti murders are there were two students who went cycling one summer in or one summer on the summer of 1959. And their names were Eine Nyssonen and Riitta Pakkanen. They were young ladies who were they decided to take this kind of semi road trip. They packed a tent, snacks, edibles, and some money, and they started cycling towards. I believe this was in eastern Finland. They left from around the middle part of Finland and made their way towards east. And they stopped along the way. They occasionally slept at hostels, but sometimes they'd also sleep in their tent. And one night they set up their tent next to a lake called Tulilahti. Tulilahti means literally lake of fire or fire lake,
Ah.
something like that. And also, as in Bodom 1 year later, they were attacked in the middle of the night. Somebody attacked their tent and murdered them both. And this case also, it wasn't as big an event necessarily as Bodom later became, but it was a big event. It was all over the media. And the police actually found the suspect. His name was Runar Holmström. Runar was it's probably a politically incorrect term, but he would have been known at that time as a village idiot. He was a kind of local pervert who enjoyed stealing panties from drying lines, that sort of a thing. Drove around in his moped and peeped on young ladies, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
And
not a very nice man.
not a very nice man and a very creepy person. If
Yeah.
you Google him and check out the images, he had this kind of weird vibe to him, just physically as well. But he was not, as they say, playing with a full deck. He was um, he during the trial after the police arrested him and he was put on trial. He seemed to be totally in a different world. It was like he didn't completely understand what was happening around him. And the prosecutor's case was that he was the killer of these two young ladies. But the defense obviously said that Runar had, first of all, no motive for this. He never took his kind of perviness to the level of assaulting people or doing anything crossing those kinds of boundaries. And Runar actually ended up killing himself. He hanged himself in his cell and left behind a letter where he claimed that he did not do it, and the reason he was committing suicide was because he believed that he was kind of scarred and he would be an outcast forever. People would believe it was him, no matter what the result of the trial would be. And I've looked into this case myself later on quite a bit, and even the judge who presided over the proceedings of the trial, even he later admitted that he never really believed that it was Runar. He didn't seem to have a motive. He just didn't seem to fit the description of the killer. And but nevertheless, he was prosecuted and he died. So some people still believe that it was him. But officially, the case is absolutely unsolved, and it remains one of our kind of more famous unsolved cases in Finland.
Was any DNA evidence, or I know we weren't really thinking about DNA evidence in '59, but was anything recovered that we could sort of use now, or?
Um, the bodies were hidden in a way where, if I remember correctly, there was some earth also kind of laying over them, the same as in the Kyllikki Saari murder. And the killer had taken his knife and sharpened the stick that he had pressed on top of the bodies. Or there was some sort of setup done like this by the killer. And the kind of intricacies of the blade of the knife were photographed with some sort of a super high definition camera at the time. So we have the kind of unique markings of the knife's blade on film, and these were later compared with Runar's knife, and the investigators claim that it was a match, but it isn't really. If you look at them yourself, it isn't an open and closed case. You can sort of look at it differently than the way the cops did at the time. So there's that kind of evidence, but I don't know if they have DNA. They probably have some of the objects and the personal belongings of the victims, maybe even belongings of Runar. But the problem with that is that DNA from such old items is not necessarily reliable anymore.
No.
So even if you're able to give a DNA analysis, it doesn't mean that will hold up in court, because the defense can say, well, it's so old. How do we know that it's believable? So on.
It seems like all of these unsolved cases in Finland have aspects that are in common. They all seem to have, commonalities in their factors. They're not varied. They're all very similarly done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, especially from that time. Then, of course, later on, the guns entered the picture and organized crime and that sort of thing. But these cases where, let's say, somebody is killed in a kind of secluded periphery setting. Well, Espoo is not periphery, but this. Yeah, I definitely see where you're going. This knife and blunt object and secluded in the middle of the night. It certainly seems to.
Always try to hide the bodies. They're never sort of just I mean, in the Kyllikki murders and these murders, it seems like the killer really went out of his way to conceal his victims.
Yes, and it also takes a particularly kind of cruel person to kill with a knife because you have to, the person's right there and they're looking at you possibly when you crush them, and so not even a gun or anything to kind of take that impersonal distance to the victim, but it
Yeah.
takes a certain particular cruelty, and that's also the kind of flip side of Finland, that it's often these really super sadistic killings that take place here, even though it's generally a peaceful and safe country. Then these murders are just totally over the top.
Yeah, stabbing someone is very personal.
Yes, it is, and also I've read some books on like criminology and psychology that there's often a kind of sexual bodily satisfaction to that kind of a killing. So it bespeaks a kind of repressed. Certainly, those were conservative times, so maybe they speak about some repressed desire or repressed
Yeah.
sexual frustration that came out in these super violent ways. Finland is still a kind of a squeamish country when it comes to these kinds of issues.
Yeah, the UK isn't so squeamish about talking about sex and
Yeah.
sexuality. I feel like we're not too far progressive, but we're quite far forward with our ways, I guess.
Yes, and certainly there, just the conversational culture in general is radically different. Brits have conversations and topics are discussed in the media openly, whereas in Finland, there's even a saying that vaikeneminen on kultaa, like being silent is golden. Or I think it's silence is golden. There's even a song called or something like that, an American song, but it fits Finland perfectly. The people are kind of generally withdrawn and morose and not very social at all. The kind of social distancing during this coronavirus has been extremely easy for Finns because it's
I have
basically like
noticed
any
that.
other day.
I have noticed that any Finns that I've seen, like, I really love F1 and hockey, so any Finns that I see interacting, they're very aloof. They're not rude, they're just very aloof and like their own space and do their own
Yes,
thing.
absolutely, absolutely. It's the kind of national character of Finns, and maybe these crimes in the 1950s and 1960s they had something of that character kind of breaking in them, and also we had just the war had ended some years ago, and there's even a kind of theory among some more artistically inclined people that something of the Winter War and the continuation of war were buried with Kyllikki Saari. She was the kind of the exception, the a good example of the kind of person that the Finnish army tried to protect. This kind of idea of an untouched virgin, religious, good girl who
Yeah.
was then murdered. But that's of course total speculation.
I mean, the war had a huge toll on its soldiers. Obviously, people coming back from war, they're
Yes, yeah.
really fucked up with everything that they've just seen, and they don't know how to reintegrate back into normal life. Like, it's the 1940s, 1950s. We don't have the support networks that we do today.
Yeah,
So I think a lot of people had it really hard.
they did, and it was never really discussed. I'm not saying that the killer of Kyllikki was, for example, a soldier of World War II,
Yeah.
but generally, it's only been in the past few years that Finland has started to talk about the trauma of the soldiers after the war and how they had witnessed these extremely horrible things, but were never really able to talk to anyone about them. And these kind of bursts of violence, like Kyllikki Saari and Tulilahti and Bodom, they kind of broke the silence of violence and its effect on the nation in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is probably more, I think, prosaic or fiction than real fact.
Then, yeah. So the next one is, please correct me if I'm wrong, Hausjärvi gravel pit murders. I know I've done that one wrong. I'm sorry.
No problem at all. It would be pretty idiotic of me to assume that people can pronounce Finnish words correctly. They're fairly difficult even for our neighboring countries. Most Swedes can't pronounce Finnish names. It's Hausjärvi, and this is a case that I've probably looked into the most. I even started writing a book about this.
Oh, wow.
Which hopefully I'll be able to finish one day. The problem is that because I'm in a coronavirus quarantine, I can't meet people and talk to them. So
That's the...
when you write a nonfiction book, it's like I've said before on my Instagram account that it's basically 90% footwork and 10% sitting down and writing.
Yeah.
But hopefully I'll be able to finish it one day. This is probably the creepiest, at least in my opinion, the creepiest unsolved Finnish case ever. Back in the late 1980s, it was 1989 actually, a woman in southern Finland, kind of alcoholic, let's say an outcast lady, was waiting for transportation. It was never made clear whether it was a bus station or a train station, but it was one of the two, waiting for public transport, when a guy pulled up in a car and offered her a ride home. You don't have to wait for the bus or train. Just get in and I'll take you home. The woman got in the car, and during the journey, the guy offered the woman drinks and some kind of mysterious pills. And what exactly these pills were was never established, but the guy offered them to the lady, and he also popped them in his own mouth. He ate them himself. There was a children's seat, sort of a child's safety seat in the back seat of the car, and it looked like a family man's car. That was later the description. The guy drove the car instead of taking the lady home. He actually drove into this really secluded back road in Hausjärvi, and this is a sort of a backwoods country road that you really need to know. Just to even know that it exists, you'll drive past it 10 times before noticing it. So the guy had obviously picked the spot beforehand, and he drove this lady to this secluded country road, stopped the car, and then assaulted the woman. But the woman was able to get away and survived this attack. Then the same thing happened again some years later. A woman was again sort of an alcoholic woman in her 40s, was waiting for a train from, if I remember correctly, it was from Riihimäki to Järvenpää, two small towns in southern Finland. And again, a guy showed up and offered a ride. And again, the lady took the offer, and the guy offered him, while they were driving, he offered her drinks and the same pills as were described in the first case. Again, they drove to this secluded country road, and the guy said, "I'm gonna step outside of the car and relieve myself." And the woman decided to do the same, and she got out of the car and bent down to pee, and that's when she heard steps approaching her quickly from behind. And the next thing she knew, she felt a sharp object, probably a knife, hit her in the head. And she went into a panic and couldn't believe what had happened, and she just darted and took off to the forest, her head bleeding, and she was screaming in agony and panic. And the last word she heard this guy say before she kind of made it out of the reach of hearing was "eipä onnistunut tällä kertaa," which means "didn't work this time." And she was able to make her way to a nearby house where they called the police, and the police came and investigated. The guy was obviously already had taken off, and nobody was ever arrested for this assault. But then, again, some months later, the body of a woman, again an alcoholic woman in her 40s, her name was Tuula Lukkarinen. Her body was found at the same exact secluded road, next to a tree, or at the bottom of a tree, kind of lining that road in the forest. And her body was just totally savagely torn to pieces. Later, when the police made an announcement of the case and spoke to the media about the particulars of the case, they actually exclusively said that they're looking for a killer who has an understanding of basic human anatomy. And what this means, it's never been made exactly clear, but there's reason to believe that the killer may have actually taken something, an inner organ or something from the woman, and the police believe that this is just my speculation, but the police may believe that he might be some kind of uh, I don't know, nurse or a
Butcher,
masseuse.
maybe?
Excuse me.
Butcher, maybe?
Butcher, possibly, yes. Somebody who understands where organs are in the body.
Yeah.
But this has never been clarified what they mean by this. But what we do know for sure is that Tuula Lukkarinen's body was totally savaged. Even the homicide detectives who arrived at the scene later said that it was an exceptionally brutal murder, one that they had never really seen in Finland before. And Tula was had been kidnapped from somewhere in the area where these previous assaults had also began. The women had been in roughly the same area, and the police investigated. They had some suspects, but nothing was ever conclusively established. And then I believe it was a couple of years later, a woman named Marit Haantie disappeared also from the same area, and she also fit the bill perfectly. She was an alcoholic in her 40s, dark hair, had the similar kind of physical appearance as these previous assault and murder victims. And her body has never been found, but she was, even the police believe, Finnish police usually are extremely skeptical. They're very adamant about not uh, acting out like FBI agents. They're very realistic and vague in their the way they communicate with the public. But even they have admitted that it's she probably ended up being a victim of this same person who had carried out these two assaults and attempted murders and one verified murder.
Yeah.
And the general consensus is that there was a serial killer in the area active around that time, and this is extremely uncommon and exceptional in Finland. This kind of a serial killer who has an MO, a modus operandi, who strikes again and again, and then goes into what they call a cool-off period, and then comes out of hiding and strikes again. This is it's almost unheard of in Finland. In Finland, it's spree killers, school shooters, that sort of thing, or then it's this scenario that I described earlier: two drunks get into a fight.
A crime of passion, sort of.
Exactly. But this guy was methodical. He even used a tool in his attacks, which was his car. He always picked up these women in his car, and it's possible that the car was dressed up to look like it was to kind of put their mind at ease that this is a family man who has children and a wife somewhere, so I can trust him.
Yeah, I've got a profile for him here.
Yes,
Between 30 and 40 years old, dark curly hair, 170 centimeters. He has basic human anatomical knowledge, like he said, and
yes,
possibly had a small child because of the kid seat in there. I've also got written down that he drove a light sedan Mazda or Datsun,
yeah,
but I've also got that he was possibly divorced or in a bad marriage or, going through a divorce, because that could be the trigger for these crimes.
Yes, and also I remember him. One of the witness descriptions, one of the people who survived, it was either the 1980 case or the 1990 case. Later said that the guy would have described a bad home life or something like that during the ride. But both of the victims who survived were extremely drunk, so we don't know for sure what he has said. We can't really
Yeah.
trust their description in this regard. But clearly, it was a guy who knew the area. I've been to that area many times. It's still there. These killings are known as the Hausjärvi gravel pit murders. But the only reason they're known as the gravel pit murders is because there's a gravel pit next to the country road where these assaults were carried out. Nothing actually happened at the gravel pit themselves, but I've been there many times, and it's when my wife and I were looking for the spot for the first time, we drove past it 2 times, and we're both from the sort of countryside, so we know country roads and that sort of a thing, how they work and how they're found and so on. But even we couldn't find the spot, so the killer has been somebody who knew this spot. Possibly he had worked there, or he was from that area, and he knew that this would be a good place to drive these women. It also, the country road kind of passes through a wooded area between two highways. So he would have known that he has to just drive his car to the road, and then he won't even have to back up back to the same road. He can just drive straight on and come to the other highway on the other side of the wooded area. So it's the perfect escape route as well in terms of how you handle your car and how you can make a quick escape in case somebody shows up.
Yeah, it feels like, especially in Finland, if you're going to do something there, then you're going to know about it. It's not exactly going to be a road that you're going to just be driving along like a motorway or a highway and you'll just come upon this place. It feels like it's a local knowledge. You've spent a lot of your time there. It's not something that maybe like me as a tourist, I wouldn't, just happen upon this by chance.
You absolutely would not happen upon it by chance. It's the killer is definitely, at least in my mind, I'm 100% certain that it was a local person who had entertained this kind of a fantasy for a long time, and you can sort of see for lack of a better term, progression from these attempts and failures to the actual success, so to speak, in
Yeah.
killing his first victim and then moving on to the next. And these are just the cases that we know about. There's probably more of them out there, and I seriously doubt if these were the only cases where this guy was involved. There was one sighting before I forget to mention it. Some locals driving down that highway where these murders happened, or the near the murder spots, noticed a man who had parked his car next to the highway and seemed to be washing it or wiping it down. And the witnesses actually called the police, told them about their observations, and the police put out a call for owners of those kinds of cars. And they did, many of them did call the police and say, I own one of those cars, and they showed up for interrogations. But those also yielded no conclusive results. So the killer is still out there. It's entirely possible he's still alive. He wasn't very old at the time. And
Yeah.
maybe he just got better and disappeared, kept on doing what he's doing.
It feels like if you looked into sort of missing person cases in that area, you probably could find cases that you think, oh well, actually that could be linked.
Yes, and oftentimes the kind of Finnish analysis, I'm sorry to say, Finnish analysis of missing persons cases, it's either kind of over the top or it's really lazy. What I mean is that if somebody goes missing, there's a group of people who believe that it has to be a serial killer every time. That there's somebody in the woods who just basically nabs people and kills them, and he's killed hundreds or something. or then it's this really lazy theorizing, like, well, he, or she wandered off to the woods drunk, and the bears ate her, or something like that. But you need to look at this sort of more realistically, and taking into account the possibility that this some cases might be tied to this killer, whereas others might not. So it might just be somebody actually getting lost in the woods and so on. But I do think that on average, if there's a serial killer out there who's listening to this and looking for a new hunting ground, Finland would be perfect, because Finnish people generally, the kind, for the most part, they're pretty lazy. That it's, well, he drowned in a lake, and that's that. There's no need to look, and that probably, that mentality and that way of thinking has made it possible for more murderers to get away with their crimes than anywhere else.
I feel like Finns sort of very much mind their own business. They're like, oh, well, there's a strange man in a strange car hanging about the woods, but that's not my business, so I'm just going to leave it.
Absolutely, and we're a very kind of nature-oriented nation. There's woods everywhere. There's lakes, and Finland even has the nickname of "Land of a Thousand Lakes." So the general kind of mentality is that, well, the nature got him. He tripped at the woods and broke his leg and never made it out, and now the skeleton is running away somewhere. And meanwhile, in some cases, not all obviously, but in some cases, it's entirely possible that there's an actual killer somewhere rubbing his hands together, thinking about how easy it is to dupe these people into thinking that it was the bears when it was actually a human killer.
That's a fair point. Now I really want to visit Finland, so maybe when this lockdown's over.
When this lockdown is over, you should definitely visit Finland, and I'll be sure to give you a personal tour of this.
Oh, very.
I have some
very
pills and some liquor in my car, so it will be a nice ride.
Not a chance. I know where this is going.
Damn it!
I just want to watch the KHL. I've never watched KHL before, so I'd like to watch that.
What, hockey, you mean?
Yeah, hockey, yeah.
Oh, you're a hockey fan?
Yes, my fiance went to Gothenburg 2
Oh,
years
nice.
ago, but he said it was very, very cold and too much snow.
There's a lot of snow, but in the winter, you should never go to southern Finland. You should go to Lapland. It's like an enchanted land during with the what are they called, northern lights in the sky and everything. But in the summer, you should definitely stay in the south. The best places are here. I thought you English women were supposed to be Fuji fans.
I don't really like football. It's not my thing.
Oh my god!
I find it quite boring.
Jesus, I think the British government just revoked your citizenship for saying that.
I'll have to be another citizen then. I'll have to get my Canadian citizenship finally.
Good. They're a hockey nation over there.
Yeah, they are a hockey nation, plus old school kind of hockey with a bit of violence. That's what we like.
True.
And the last case, I'm not even going to try and pronounce this one. I'll leave this to you.
Wonderful, I'll take it away. It's the Ulvila murder case from 2006. This is the more recent mystery that's still pretty much all over the papers. There was a family sleeping in their home one night in 2006 when the mother and father woke up to the sound of glass breaking in their bedroom. And there was a kind of glass door that led from the outside balcony opening up to the backyard into the house, and somebody was smashing this door to pieces. And once the door was sufficiently, or the window rather, was sufficiently smashed, the killer, or this unknown intruder, jumped up and entered the house through that window. And at this point, the wife, whose name was Anneli Auer, Anneli took off to the kitchen and started to call the police, while Jukka, who was the husband, began a physical struggle with this killer, believing apparently that he was there to harm his children or something like that. And the actual 112, or what is the emergency number in Britain, by the way?
999.
Okay, so the 999 call is on YouTube. It's in Finnish, but it's one of the most terrifying recordings ever. It's Anneli speaking on the phone to the cops while Jukka is supposedly struggling with the attacker. And this attacker struggled with Jukka for a fairly extended period of time, and ultimately the struggle ended with Jukka being murdered. And it was a really, again, a totally gruesome murder. There was a knife that was used as the murder weapon. And after killing Jukka, the killer supposedly left the same way he came in. He jumped out through that door window and disappeared into the night. And the police arrived sometime later. It was a fairly quick response. The ambulance was there, but Jukka was already dead. And it was a really bloody, devastating crime scene, made all the more terrible by the fact that the children had woken up, and one of the kids had apparently witnessed the actual murder, had
horrible.
seen this killer murder her father. The killer was dressed in all black. He had a black coat, black trousers, and one of those, I think it's known as a balaclava. It's one of those, it covers your face, the kind of mask, and that was black as well. He was wearing black gloves, and he had the knife with him. And Anneli was taken along with the children to the local hospital. There was nothing to be done about Jukka anymore. He had been murdered. And the police began to investigate this case, and fairly early on, the kind of police camp was divided in the middle. There were those who believed that it was an outside intruder. In other words, the story that Anneli gave them was true. But then there were also those who began to sort of doubt the story. It didn't seem to fit Anneli's description of what happened that night. And these were the people who believed that it was actually Anneli who murdered her husband and then staged the scene. And during the 999, the emergency call, you can actually hear Jukka's voice in the background. You can also hear one of the children giving this gut-wrenching scream when she sees her father murdered on the floor. And the people in the kind of inside killer versus outside killer group believe that these sounds of Jukka struggling came from a tape that Anneli had recorded the murder earlier and was now playing the tape in the background in order to make the 999 call sound like it was happening at the moment. The case went to court, and there were so many twists and turns in the case. It would take all night for me to go through them. But long story short, one court ended up finding Anneli guilty, another found her innocent, another found her guilty, and again another found her innocent. And the case kind of came to something of a close, or at least entered a passive period when Anneli was finally let go, and she started a new life and found a new boyfriend and everything. And then suddenly she was brought back to prison. And this time the police claimed that they found in her possession evidence of some kind of sexual violence towards her own children. And some of the cops who were involved in the investigation, this is where it gets totally insane. They even believed, or at least claimed to believe, that there was somehow Satanism involved, that the occult was somehow involved in this, basically in Anneli's life. In other words, she had murdered her husband, sexually abused her children, taken photographs of it with her new boyfriend, who was supposedly also a pedophile, and the occult was somehow involved in all
The
of this.
occult's always involved when
It's
shit like
always
this
involved.
happens.
And
Always.
it was just, I don't even personally know what the status of the case is, even now in 2020, because it's taken so many twists and turns over the years. It's easily one of the most insane killings ever. But officially, the murder of Jukka Aslahti, the husband, remains unsolved. But Finland is basically divided in terms of whether it was an actual outside intruder or an inside intruder or
Yeah,
inside murderer.
the notes that I have here that 2016 she was found not guilty and she was awarded 500,000 euros, which is 800 euros for each day that she was falsely imprisoned.
Yeah.
Which is, I believe, the highest in Finland, which is a lot of money. That's certainly a lot.
Might actually be the highest. It was a large amount, but there are still some who absolutely believe that it was Anneli who carried out these murders. And certainly,
Yeah.
if you actually look at, I'm going to do a movie recommendation at this point. There's a fantastic documentary about this totally baffling case, available for free on YouTube. It's called. Are you able to attach links to the description of the episode or something like that?
Yeah, I can certainly put a link in because I'll be watching this tonight myself.
Okay, wonderful. The title of the documentary is Ulvila Murhamysteri, which means the Ulvila murder mystery. The person who has uploaded it, maybe this will be easier to find if somebody doesn't want to click the link for some reason. It's Johnny Pietila, Pietila. This person has uploaded this documentary that's very thorough. It's told from the perspective of Anneli, the wife, but it's fairly objective, and it tells you the whole totally insane story of this murder. But like I said, it's officially unsolved, and the house is still there. There's new occupants there. I've been there myself, and it's another one of these cases where you don't just happen upon it. It's kind of secluded from a slightly bigger town. It's basically the suburb of a town called Pori, and Jukka Lahti was a social psychologist at a factory, and apparently he was hated by some. He kind of divided opinions, and the main theory among the outside intruder theorists is that it was somebody that Jukka had been involved in setting free from the company, firing from the company. Whereas the inside killer theorists believe that, first of all, Jukka Lahti was a fairly short guy. He was not a very physically big dude, and Anneli was much taller than he was. And they believe that there was a domestic quarrel that kind of went off over the rails, and Anneli ended up stabbing her husband to death. But as that documentary will tell you much better than I can, it's a totally murky case. It could be either way, basically.
It seems like a very, very confusing one. So
it is, and the cops have even the cops seem to be totally divided on this. Usually, there's a fairly, especially in a kind of consensus-driven country like Finland, there, particularly with the police and the government and officials and authorities, there's usually a fairly seamless consensus as to what happened at A or B. But with this, it's totally divided. There's even been people have resigned from the police because of this case, because they believe so strongly about it and believe that the others are wrong. So they've kind of resigned in protest over this case. Anneli herself, if you watch her interviews, which are featured in the documentary, she is kind of strangely aloof, I guess. She even at the just right after the murder, she's interviewed by the police at a hospital. Even then, she kind of fairly, somewhat cold manner describes
Yeah.
that. We just want to put this behind us and move on with our lives.
Yeah, very like distance from the fact that her husband
Distance
has
from it, yes, but
been
as
murdered.
but as anybody who has looked into true crime for a long time knows, that in itself is not really even evidence of anything. So people respond to panic in
Yeah,
different ways.
people grieve or respond to trauma
Exactly,
in very different ways. So you can't really judge how someone is gonna react to something.
exactly, and of course, for some people who perhaps are not as read in or are not as much of aficionados in true crime, it might be an open and shut case for them. Well, it's the bitch is cold and she probably killed her husband. But like you said, it's people. It could also be a kind of defense reaction. You can't believe your brain hasn't completely
Yeah,
absorbed
brain.
what has happened, so it's like watching a movie and you talk about it the way you talk about something you saw in a movie.
It's a very common feature with trauma is that it will sort of be compartmentalized or the brain will just completely dissociate because it's too painful for the brain to deal with, so it'll just dissociate and be like, well, that's not happened and never happened. We'll just ignore that.
Exactly. And that interview with her in the hospital after the killings has been one of the key sort of components in painting her guilty of this case, because it's so easy to watch it and say, well, there's no way an innocent person would talk this way, but when you look deeper into it, you realize that there's more to it than
Yeah.
just an open and shut case.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest. Just remind everyone where they can find you before we wrap this one up.
Yeah, it was my pleasure to be on. This is a wonderful show. I love these podcasts where it's one or two people. I'm not a big fan of shows where there's three or even more people. It gets muffled and it's impossible to hear. So you have a really fantastic podcast.
Thank you.
People can find me at instagram.com dash, or is it a slash, FORENSEEK, or they can go to forensic.app, FORENSEEK.app. Those are my sites.
Perfect. Thank you. So, remember, friends, stay safe and stay spooky.